explanation that explained the lagging of magnetic effects when electromagnetic forces are changed, recognized some flaws in Pupin's talk. As this would be one of his earliest attempts to express himself before his peers in the difficult English language, he carefully bolstered the addendum by bringing along calculations and drawings. Working in Yonkers, Steinmetz had developed a single-phase commutator motor a year before, in the summer of 1890. With brazenly long shoulder-length hair, the gnome was dressed in a slightly wrinkled three-piece suit adorned with an opulent watch chain and a pair of pince-nez that hung distinctively from a strap attached to his right collar. Standing to his full height of 4 feet, and reaching for his glasses to read off his calculations, Steinmetz noted in his German accent that Ferraris built only a little toy. He also went on to correct Pupin's implication that the Dobrovolsky creation was the first to use a three-phase system. I cannot agree with that in the least, for that already exists in the old Tesla motor. Summing up, Steinmetz concluded, I really cannot see anything new in the new Dobrovolsky system. It would take a few months for Steinmetz to realize why his colleagues raised their eyebrows as he dashed all hopes for Dobrovolsky's claims. Nevertheless, they were impressed with his analysis and mathematical expertise. Elihu Thomson returned to his firm of Thomson Houston in Lynn, Massachusetts, with the knowledge that a new mathematical genius had arrived from Europe, and soon thereafter Thomson Houston offered Steinmetz a job at Lynn. Meanwhile, in Pittsburgh, unbeknown to Edison, Westinghouse had been surreptitiously meeting with Henry Villard, Edison's financial backer, over a 2-year period to discuss a possible merger. Villard, who had recently combined a number of smaller companies with Edison Electric to create Edison General Electric, was well aware that Edison did not get along with Westinghouse. Villard was an immigrant from Germany, the son of a Bavarian judge. Having tried in his earlier days to set up a free-soil German settlement in Kansas, Villard was the individual who drove the golden spike in the Northern Pacific Railroad to link the West Coast with the East. He conferred with J. Pierpont Morgan, the real power behind the operation, and had Morgan send Edward Dean Adams, a long-time banking associate, to Menlo Park to try and get Edison to align with Westinghouse. Thriving on beating the other guy, Edison would hear none of it. Westinghouse, he said, has gone crazy over sudden accession of wealth or something unknown to me, and is flying a kite that will land him in the mud sooner or later. Legal fees in trying to protect the Edison light bulb patents had already cost Edison $2 million, and Westinghouse the same. The Edison camp had decided to sue Westinghouse rather than Thomson Houston, because the Pittsburgh company had purchased United States Electric, the concern that held the competing patents from Sawyer Mann and Hiram Maxson, while Thomson Houston had only a lease agreement. Thus, while two giants fought each other in what Edison called a suicide of time, Thomson Houston got rich. On July the 14th, 1891, after many years of battles and appeals on priority of invention of the light bulb, Judge Bradley ruled in favor of Edison. Although Westinghouse was caught with the wrong light bulb patents, his Tesla AC power system was an asset worth attaining. But Westinghouse was proving difficult to negotiate with. Villard therefore began to make overtures to Tesla directly, but the inventor had to yield to Westinghouse's decisions. Dear Sir, Tesla wrote Villard in his tidiest penmanship, I have approached Mr. Westinghouse in a number of ways and endeavored to get to an understanding, but the results have not been very promising. Realizing this, and also considering carefully the chances and probabilities of success, I have concluded that I cannot associate myself with the undertaking you contemplate. Tesla reluctantly concluded the letter by wishing the financier best success in his pioneer enterprise. Villard switched tactics and approached Thomson Houston with the thought of buying them out. He had gone up to Lynn, Massachusetts in February and had continued secret negotiations with Charles Coffin, Chief Executive Officer, CEO of Thomson Houston, throughout the summer. In December, a meeting was held at 23 Wall Street in Morgan's office to finalize plans for a merger. After Morgan looked over the financial records of both companies, he realized that Edison Electric, which was in debt for $3.5 million, had less revenue than the smaller and solvent Thomson Houston. Morgan therefore reversed himself and suggested that Thomson Houston buy out Edison Electric. Either way, he created a monopoly. Simultaneously, Morgan maneuvered Villard out of the company altogether. He had to blame someone for the problems, and Charles Coffin took control of the new consolidation. They named the company General Electric, GE. Because of the enormous debt of his company and the possibility that he was working with inferior DC equipment, Edison had lost his edge. The thought of working with that patent pirate Elihu Thomson and the removal of his own name from the marquee made the electrical wizard, for the time, a beaten man. Although he stirred the hornet's nest before he left, Edison realized that a new age of electricity had arrived, one that would not countenance his common-sense trial-and-error approach. Over a year before the actual merger was completed, he wrote Villard, "It is clear that my usefulness is gone. Viewing it from this light, you will see how impossible it is for me to spur my mind under the shadow of possible future affiliations. I would now ask that you not oppose my gradual retirement from the lighting business, which will enable me to enter into fresh and congenial fields of work." And so Edison turned his interests to furthering the work of Edward Muybridge, a pioneer in motion pictures. In 1888 and 1891, he had his first patents on a device he called the kinetograph, and a few years later he developed a fully working movie camera and projection system. In 1893, Edison could write to the elderly Muybridge that he now had a peep show device that people would pay 5 cents to see. The Morganization of GE created an even greater foe for Westinghouse, but also a critical problem for GE. Whereas Westinghouse was blocked from using an efficient light bulb, GE was blocked from generating AC. As the Edison patents were only valid for another 2 years, certainly Westinghouse was in the better position. But in 1891 to 92, it was still too early in the game to realize this. From the point of view of the courts, it was still undecided as to who the author of the AC polyphase system really was, even though Westinghouse had the Ferrari's patent trump card to back those of Tesla's, and so, over the next few years, Westinghouse was forced to sue not only a number of subsidiaries of GE, but also some independents, such as William Stanley, who were now producing polyphase systems on their own. From GE's point of view, there was a whole host of patents in AC that Thomson owned, but any others that they could obtain would undoubtedly help in the legal arena. Thus they approached Charles Steinmetz with a scheme to work on improvements on AC designs in such a way that they would obscure Tesla's role. Attracted to the intrigue, Steinmetz accepted the challenge. The fray between Westinghouse and GE took a new turn in the race to win the bid to light the upcoming Chicago World's Fair and to harness Niagara Falls. In the courts, the suits switched from light bulbs to power generation, and at their respective plants, attention turned toward a way to compete with the success achieved by Brown and Dobrovolsky. For Westinghouse Corporation, Schmidt, Scott, and Lamb could confer with Tesla, while Stilwell and Schellenberger brooded, and the money men reluctantly agreed to dismantle the very lucrative but outmoded Golar-Gibbs machinery. For GE, the situation was more complex. They had hoped that someone like Steinmetz or Thomson could come up with a competing design, but they hadn't realized that Tesla held all the fundamental patents. Quite simply, there was no other system. Tesla had understood the foundation. One couldn't proceed without him. Thomson and Steinmetz were reduced to figuring out ways to somehow bypass the patents by designing teaser currents or some other smokescreen device in order to pretend that they had created a separate invention. In a case of industrial espionage, Thomson Houston apparently paid a janitor to steal the Tesla blueprints from the Westinghouse plant. Embarrassed to explain how the blueprints ended up at Lynn, Thomson said that he needed to study the Tesla motor designs to make sure that his were different. The intrigue must have triggered a variety of emotions in Steinmetz. He had already lived a clandestine life in Germany. By editing a radical socialist newspaper under a pseudonym during the so-called Reign of Terror, he had learned to use secret passwords at radical meetings and write with invisible ink, as when he carried love notes between his leader, the charismatic revolutionary Heinrich Lux, who had been jailed for his activities, and Lux's girlfriend. Although Steinmetz never renounced his affiliation with the socialist movement, he supported a rather unscrupulous capitalistic corporate structure that was motivated not only by the all-consuming profit motive, but also by its ability to subvert the law to achieve its ends. This new situation thereby only served to heighten his contradictory nature. His affiliation with the Machiavellian policies of GE induced Steinmetz to abandon his ideals. His opus on AC, Theory and Calculation of Alternating Current Phenomena, co-authored with Ernst Julius Berg, a colleague educated at the Royal Polytechnicum in Stockholm, and first published in 1897, just 3 years after Tesla's own compendium, omitted any reference to Tesla at all. By the turn of the century, Berg's name on the cover, like Lux's love notes, disappeared. At the time, Tesla's book, The Inventions, Researches and Writings of Nikola Tesla, edited by T.C. Martin, was a veritable Bible for all engineers in the field. It included chapters on alternating current motors, the rotating magnetic field, synchronizing motors, rotating field transformers, polyphase systems, single-phase motors, etc. That it does not appear in the bibliography of Steinmetz's work is astounding. In the foreword to Steinmetz's second text, Theoretical Elements of Electrical Engineering, written in 1902, the author tries to explain why he omitted reference to the inventor of the AC polyphase system. Of later years, Steinmetz wrote, the electrical literature has been haunted by so many theories, for instance of the induction motor, which are incorrect. This was a natural opening that might have catapulted Steinmetz into a discussion which would set the record straight, but he chose a pusillanimous path instead. This decision not only aided in obfuscating the truth as to the origin of the invention, it also bolstered his own image in the corporate community. As these texts on AC would serve as important templates for subsequent writers, it was quite common in the later years for engineers to obtain degrees, study AC, and even write textbooks on the topic themselves, and never come across Tesla's name. Clearly, it was to GE's benefit to pretend that Tesla never existed, and it was to Westinghouse's benefit to pretend that the Laufen-Frankfurt transmission had never occurred. The next generation of engineers, and those that followed, never realized that obfuscation had taken place. That is one of the main reasons why Tesla's name practically vanished. Perhaps the most blatant case of misrepresentation occurred a generation later, when Mikhail Pupin published his Pulitzer Prize-winning autobiography, From Immigrant to Inventor. Pupin was able to write long passages on the history of AC and ignore Tesla almost completely. Tesla's name appears only once, in passing, in the 396-page book. In this work, Pupin described 4 historical events very important in the annals of electrical science, that is, the Laufen-Frankfurt transmission, the harnessing of Niagara Falls, the formation of GE, and the lighting of the Chicago World's Fair by AC. Mentioning the Westinghouse concern only once as a company that was interested in AC, Pupin concluded, if the Thomson-Houston Company had contributed nothing else than Elihu Thomson to GE, it would have contributed more than enough. Thus, the senseless opposition to the alternating current system vanished quickly. In the preface, Pupin had the audacity to write that the main objective of my narrative is to describe the rise of idealism in American science, and particularly in physical sciences and the related industries. As witness to this gradual development, this testimony has competence and weight. Considering that Pupin is generally remembered fondly by the engineering world, it is my opinion that he failed to live up to the standards to which he aspired. These attempts to alter the past turned the stomach of a number of key players, most notably C.E.L. Brown of Oerlikon Works in Switzerland, and one of his top engineers, B.A. Behrendt. A staunch man with a granite profile and hound dog eyes, Brown, who with Dobrovolsky had been the first engineer to transmit electrical power over long distances with Tesla's AC invention, had learned of Tesla's work from British engineer Gisbert Kapp, who published Tesla's 1888 talk in his magazine Industries. Kapp, who authored one of the most brilliant textbooks on induction motors, wrote Tesla on June 9, 1888, to request the use of his paper for the magazine. Based on Tesla's treatise and Kapp's refinements, Brown was able to construct, before Westinghouse probably, the first successful motor in 1890. Brown's succinct response, conspicuously placed in Electrical World, was directed specifically to Carl Herring, one of the first writers to imply that the invention was Dobrovolsky's. "The three-phase current as applied at Frankfurt," Brown wrote, "is due to the labours of Mr. Tesla, and will be found clearly specified in his patents." Herring's first response was to continue the artifice. "I do not think," Herring said, "that Mr. Brown does proper justice to the real inventor of this modification of the Ferraris-Tesla system, namely Dobrovolsky." But Tesla demanded a more clear-cut communique. After a discussion with W.J. Johnston, who would later allow Herring to take over the editorship of Electrical World, Tesla was able to obtain the following response. "We desire to state right here," Johnston said, "that the Electrical World has over and over put itself on record as upholding Mr. Tesla's priority." The magazine was also able to extract from Herring the following. "Dobrovolsky, though he may have been an independent inventor, admits that Tesla's work is prior to his." Although Herring was loath to admit Tesla's priority, at the same time he placed his finger on an important point. Tesla himself had not demonstrated physically that his system could be used for long-distance transmission. Certainly Westinghouse at that time was not aware of the vast benefits of the system. Had it not been for the success at Laufen Frankfurt, Tesla's apparatus might have evolved differently in America. Herring did not have access to various details of the Westinghouse motors, and that was because the work was not in the public domain. Great amounts of money were spent to keep the work private. Had a Laufen Frankfurt type of transmission occurred in America without Westinghouse's permission, it would have clearly been a case of patent piracy. Tesla issued patents in most of the industrialized countries, and it appears likely that Brown and Oerlikon licensed Tesla's patents and paid him for the privilege of using them. Coincidentally, Gisbert Kapp's treatise, which was initially published in 2 installments in December 1890 in The Electrician in London, appears also to have been used extensively by Charles Steinmetz in 1891 and 1892, while he was constructing AC motors at a machine shop in New York before he was hired by Thomson, according to B.A. Behrendt, author of one of the first definitive works on the AC motor. An émigré from Switzerland, Behrendt came to work for the New England Granite Company, a division of GE, in 1896. Particularly upset by the tactics of such writers as Steinmetz in using other people's work and leaving their names out of the bibliography, Behrendt would later become one of Tesla's most important allies. In the foreword of his book, Behrendt states, "The tendency to write books without references is due largely to the desire to avoid the looking up of other writers' papers. The reader is not benefited by such treatment, as he may frequently prefer the original to the treatment of the author whose book he is reading. Besides, a knowledge of the literature of our profession is essential to an understanding of the art and to an honest interpretation of the part played therein by our fellow workers." Writing to Oliver Heaviside specifically about such authors as Steinmetz, Behrendt quoted Huxley, "Magna est veritas et priva libet," translating and modifying the quote as follows. "Truth is great, certainly, but considering her greatness, it is curious what a long time she is apt to take about prevailing." The body of his book began with this sentence: "The induction motor, or rotary field motor, was invented by Mr. Nikola Tesla in 1888. Tesla's picture also appeared as the frontispiece. Throughout his life, Behrendt sought to set the record straight as to who the real author of the AC polyphase system was. When Westinghouse sued New England Granite for patent infringements, Berendt was placed in an embarrassing and disagreeable position. The High Command, which stemmed from Wall Street, wanted him to testify against Tesla. On May 3, 1901, Berendt wrote back to the attorney Arthur Stem, "My dear sir, you will see that I am now, even more than I have been before, of the opinion that it is not possible for us to bring forth arguments that could go to show the invalidity of the Tesla patents in suit. I cannot undertake this duty." 10. The Royal Society, 1892. The lecture given by Mr. Tesla will live long in the imagination of every person that heard him, opening as it did to many of them for the first time apparently limitless possibilities in the applications and control of electricity. Seldom has there been such a gathering of all the foremost electrical authorities of the day on the tiptoe of expectation. Electrical Review. The rapid progress in the field of electromagnetic radiation, opened up by the findings of Sir William Crookes, Sir Oliver Lodge, and especially Hertz, induced in Tesla a mania to complete as many patents as he could. Summoning his prodigious powers of self-denial, depriving himself of sleep, and exerting the full potential of his will, Tesla unfurled his creations as fast as he could. It was at this time that the grand vision arose of wireless transmission of electrical power, and he simply abhorred the thought that someone else should invent it before he could. Thus he began to build ever more powerful coils, while at the same time continuing his numerous experiments in high-intensity lighting, ozone production, converting AC to DC, and wireless communication. In February 1891, Tesla applied for the first of 3 portentous patents for the conversion and distribution of electrical energy. This invention, which was finalized after his return from Europe, was the mechanical oscillator, a completely unique multi-purpose device. Unlike the Hertz spark gap apparatus, which produced slow rhythmic discharges, the Tesla oscillator supplied a smooth, continuous current which could not only generate hundreds of thousands or even millions of volts, but could also be tuned to specific frequencies. Over his lifetime, Tesla said, "I developed not less than 50 types of these transformers, each complete in every detail." The device was, in essence, a small engine with almost no moving parts. The work-performing piston was not connected with anything else, but was perfectly free to vibrate at an enormous rate. "In this machine," Tesla proclaimed, "I succeeded in doing away with all packings, valves, and lubrication, although the utilization of oil was intrinsic to its design. By combining this engine with a dynamo, I produced a highly efficient generator, which propagated an unvarying rate of oscillation." Since the current was so absolutely steady and uniform, one could keep the time of day with the machine. In fact, the inventor also used the oscillator as a clock. In June 1891, Tesla came upon an article by Professor J.J. Thomson. This British scientist, whose work would lead him to a Nobel Prize as the discoverer of the electron, was in the process of directing electrical beams from cathode ray tubes so as to study the structure of electromagnetic energy. These investigations prompted a vigorous exchange in the electrical journals between these two men, and inspired Tesla to return with renewed zeal to my own experiments. Soon my efforts were centered upon producing in a small space the most intense inductive action. Tesla would describe these exciting results to Thomson in person 6 months later during the lectures he gave in London. That same year, Tesla took out 2 more patents on AC motors which he owed Westinghouse. He also took out a patent on an electrical meter and a condenser, and 2 on incandescent lighting. On January 8, 1892, T.C. Martin, Josh Wetzler, and George Sheep sent Tesla an invitation to dine and spend an evening before your journey to Europe. Tesla's glassblower, David Hirgezel, provided all of the tubes necessary for the trip. Sailing on the 16th, Tesla arrived in London on the 26th. Sir William Preece provided a horse and carriage for the young inventor, and invited Tesla to stay at his house. Tesla's plan was to speak before the Institution of Electrical Engineers a week later, and leave immediately for Paris to lecture before the Société Française des Électriciens. It must have been gratifying that Preece took an interest, as he was part of the old guard. 22 years Tesla's senior and one of the patriarchs of the British scientific community, Preece was an amiable gentleman with a full rich beard, high forehead, wire-rimmed glasses, and an air of self-assurance. As head of the government's postal telegraph office, Preece had worked with telegraphy as far back as 1860, and had brought Bell's telephone, along with Bell himself, to the British Isles in the mid-1870s. He had also been associated with Edison since 1877, having coined the term Edison effect after visiting the wizard in 1884 to study his work with vacuum lamps and a peculiar effect whereby electronic particles flowed through space from the negative pole to the positive. Using this device as a voltage regulator, Preece returned to England to show his colleagues, especially Ambrose Fleming. After a few days of enjoyable company and a tour of London, Tesla relaxed, and on Wednesday, February the 3rd, his discourse, entitled Experiments with Alternate Currents of High Potential and High Frequency, was presented. For a full 2 hours, Mr. Tesla kept his audience spellbound. Before such colleagues as J.J. Thomson, Oliver Heaviside, Sylvanus P. Thomson, Joseph Swan, Sir John Ambrose Fleming, Sir James Dewar, Sir William Preece, Sir Oliver Lodge, Sir William Crookes, and Lord Kelvin, Tesla proclaimed the driving force of his motivation. Is there, I ask, can there be a more interesting study than that of alternating current? We observe how this energy takes the many forms of heat, light, mechanical energy, and even chemical affinity. All of these observations fascinate us. Each day we go to our work in the hope that someone, no matter who, may find a solution to one of the pending problems, and each succeeding day we return to our task with renewed ardor. And even if we are unsuccessful, our work has not been in vain, for in these strivings we have found hours of untold pleasure, and we have directed our energies to the benefit of mankind. Any feature of merit which this work may contain, Tesla humbly stated, was derived from the work of a number of scientists who are present today, not a few who can lay better claim than myself. Looking about the room, and with a gleam in his eye, Tesla continued, One at least I must mention. It is a name associated with the most beautiful invention ever made. It is Crookes. I believe that the origin of my advances was that fascinating little book on radiant energy which I read many years ago. Firing up his great coil amid erupting thunderbolts, Tesla spoke as if a sorcerer. He announced that with his knowledge he had the ability to make animate that which was inert. With wonder and delight, we note the effects of strange forces which we bring into play, which allow us to transform, to transmit and direct energy at will. We see the mass of iron and wires behave as though endowed with life. Lamps suddenly burst forth in a variety of magnificent colors of phosphorescent light. Tesla touched a wire, and sparks ejaculated from its end. He created sheets of luminescence, directed electrical streams upon small surfaces, lit wireless tubes simply by picking them up, and erased them by holding a wire from a distant terminal, i.e., grounding the effect, or by grasping the tube with both hands, thereby rendering dark the area in between and pulling his hands apart in a steady stroke. And just as easily he would rotate the tube in the direction of axis of the coil and reignite the glow. His theories on the relationship of wavelength to the structure and manufacture of light and his displays of wireless fluorescent tubes prompted one viewer to postulate that the future mode of lighting a dwelling might occur by actually rendering the whole mass of air in the room softly and beautifully phosphorescent. Tesla unveiled his first true radio tube in the second month of 1892 in the presence of all of the key forefathers of the invention of the wireless. In order to obtain the most perfect vacuum possible, the adept had extracted the air from a bulb that was contained inside another vacuum tube. Within this inner chamber, Tesla generated a beam of light, devoid of any inertia. By producing extremely high frequencies, he created an electric brush that was so sensitive that it responded even to the stiffening of the muscles in a person's arm. This brush tended to circle away from an approaching person, but always in a clockwise direction. Noting that the ray was extremely susceptible to magnetic influences, Tesla speculated that its direction of rotation was probably affected by the geomagnetic torque of the Earth. He further expected that this brush would rotate counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. Only a magnet could get the stream of light to reverse its direction of rotation. "I am firmly convinced," Tesla stated, "that such a brush, when we learn how to produce it properly, may be the means of transmitting intelligence to a distance without wires." Of these phenomena, Tesla began in the next phase, the most fascinating for an audience are certainly those which are noted in an electrostatic field acting through a considerable distance. By properly constructing a coil, he continued, I have found that I could excite vacuum tubes no matter where they were held in the room. Referring to the work of J. Thomson and J. A. Fleming on the creation of a luminous thread within a vacuum tube, Tesla went on to discuss different methods of exciting vacuum tubes by altering the wavelength or the length of the tube. Setting up a fan as an analog and discussing the research of Preece, Hertz, and Lodge on the radiation of electromagnetic energy into the Earth and space, Tesla then displayed no-wire motors. It is not necessary to have even a single connection between the motor and generator, he announced, except perhaps through the ground, or through the rarefied air. There is no doubt that with enormous potentials, luminous discharges might be passed through many miles of rarefied air, and that, by thus directing the energy of many hundreds of horsepower, motors or lamps might be operated at considerable distances from stationary sources. Based on research conducted the year before, which had been prompted by the work of J. Thomson in propagating streams of electrical energy, Tesla expanded upon his high-intensity button lamp, a device that could dematerialize or vaporize matter. This arrangement, as we shall see, is precisely the configuration required to create laser beams. Most likely, Tesla displayed actual laser beams at this time. However, neither he nor the other scientists present at the time recognized the unique importance of the directed ray, as it was part of a combination of other lighting effects which resulted in the disintegration of the material that was being bombarded. There are two types of standard lasers which correspond to Tesla's work. One, a ruby laser, which reflects energy back to its source, which in turn stimulates more atoms into emitting special radiation, and two, a gas laser, which consists of a tube filled with helium and neon. High voltage is applied across two electrodes near the ends of the tube, causing a discharge to take place. In both instances, the excited atoms are contained in an enclosure and then reflected into one specific direction. They differ from ordinary flashlights not only because they emit a uniform wavelength of light, but also because there is a pausing, metastable state before the light is emitted. Tesla worked with lamps constructed in exactly these ways. The first he called a button lamp, the second an exhausted or phosphorescent tube. Their prime function was as efficient illumination devices. Their secondary functions were as laboratory apparatus for a variety of experiments. In one tube filled with rarefied gas, once the glass fiber is heated, the discharge breaks through its entire length instantaneously. Another bulb was painted on one side with a phosphorescent powder or mixture, and threw a dazzling light far beyond that yielded by any ordinary phosphorescence. A common experiment of mine was to pass through a coil energy at a rate of several thousand horsepower, put a piece of thick tin foil on a stick, and approach it to that coil. The tin foil would not only melt, but it would be evaporated, and the whole process took place in so small an interval of time that it was like a cannon shot. That was a striking experiment. Tesla also constructed a type of button lamp which could disintegrate any material, including zirconia and diamonds, the hardest substances known to exist. The lamp was, in essence, a globe coated inside with a reflective material, like the Leyden jar, and a button of any substance, most often carbon, which was highly polished and attached to a source of power. Once electrified, the button would radiate energy which would bounce off the interior of the globe and back onto itself, thereby intensifying a bombardment effect. In this way, the button would be vaporized. Tesla next described precisely the invention of the ruby laser over 5 decades before its reappearance in the middle of the 20th century. The description is quite explicit. In an exhausted bulb, we can concentrate any amount of energy upon a minute button of zirconia, which glowed with an almost intense light, and the stream of particles projected out was of a vivid white. Magnificent light effects were noted, of which it would be difficult to give an adequate idea. To illustrate the effect observed with a ruby drop, at first one may see a narrow funnel of white light projected against the top of the globe, where it produces an irregularly outlined phosphorescent patch. In this manner, an intensely phosphorescent, sharply defined line corresponding to the outline of the drop, fused ruby, is produced, which spreads slowly over the globe as the drop gets larger. A more perfect result, used in some of these bulbs, involves the construction of a zinc sheet, performing the double office of intensifier and reflector. The inventor's talk ended with the speculation that with improvements in the construction of long-distance cables, per his suggestions, telephony across the Atlantic would soon be possible. It is significant to note that at this moment he did not yet envision wireless transmission of voice, but rather wireless transmission of intelligence, i.e. Morse code, light and power. His discussions with Preece, however, on the existence of earth currents was beginning to take hold, and shortly afterward Tesla began to conceptualize the idea of transmitting voice and even pictures by means of wireless. It has been my chief aim in presenting these results to point out phenomena or features of novelty, Tesla concluded, and to advance ideas which I am hopeful will serve as starting points of new departures. It has been my chief desire this evening to entertain you with some novel experiments. Your applause, so frequently and generously accorded, has told me that I have succeeded. At the end of the lecture, Mr. Tesla tantalizingly informed his listeners that he had shown them but 1/3 of what he was prepared to do, and the whole audience remained in their seats, unwilling to disperse, insisting upon more, and Mr. Tesla had to deliver a supplementary lecture. It may be stated, as Mr. Tesla mentioned, but which hardly seems to be realized, that practically the whole of the experiments shown were new and had never been shown before, and were not merely a repetition of those given in America. Having seen the inventor handle such enormous voltages so unconcernedly, many of the attendees mumbled surprise among themselves, and gathered the courage to inquire how Tesla dared to take the current through his body. It was the result of a long debate in my mind, Tesla replied, but through calculation and reason I concluded that such currents ought not to be dangerous to life any more than the vibrations of light are dangerous. Consider a thin diaphragm in a water pipe with to and fro piston strikes of considerable amplitude. The diaphragm will be ruptured at once, the inventor explained by analogy. With reduced strokes of the same total energy, the diaphragm will be less liable to rupture, until, with a vibratory impulse of many thousands per second, no actual current flows, and the diaphragm is in no danger of rupture. So with the vibratory current. In other words, Tesla had increased the frequency or alterations per second, but reduced the amplitude or power greatly. The wizard thereupon fired up the coil once again, sending tens of thousands of volts through or around his body, and illuminated 2 fluorescent tubes which he held dramatically in each hand. "As you can see," Tesla added, "I am very much alive." "That we can see," one member responded. "But is there no pain?" "A spark, of course, passes through my hands and may puncture the skin, and sometimes I receive an occasional burn, but that is all, and even this can be avoided if I hold a conductor of suitable size in my hand and then take hold of the current." "In spite of your reasons," another concluded with a shake of his head, "your speculation resembles to me the feelings that a man must have before plunging off the Brooklyn Bridge." In listening to Tesla's statement that he had only shown part of what he had prepared, the perspicacious Professor Dewar, inventor of the Dewar flask, or everyday hot and cold thermos, took the inventor at face value and realized that there was more information to impart. The wizard had simply run out of time. As a member of the board of the Royal Institution, also situated in London, Dewar knew that there were many dignitaries who missed the grand event, especially Lord Raleigh. So he set himself the task of persuading Tesla to present an encore the following evening. After the talk, Dewar escorted Tesla on a tour of the Royal Institution, where he displayed the work of his predecessors, especially Michael Faraday's apparatus. "Why not stay for one more performance?" Dewar inquired. "I must go to Paris," Tesla insisted, keeping foremost in his mind his desire to limit the time of his visits at each stop so that he could return to the States as quickly as possible. "How often do you think you'll have the chance to visit the laboratories of such men as Crookes or Kelvin?" Dewar asked in his Scottish brogue. At the same time, he invited Tesla to visit his own lab, where he was creating extremely low temperatures that approached absolute zero, and conducting pioneer studies of electromagnetic effects in such environments as liquid oxygen. "You've already lived in Paris. Now see London." "I was a man of firm resolve," Tesla admitted later, but succumbed easily to the forceful arguments of the great Scotchman. He pushed me into a chair and poured out half a glass of wonderful brown fluid which sparkled in all sorts of iridescent colours and tasted like nectar. "Now," Dewar declared with a twinkle in his eye and a grin that brought one of reciprocation on the face of his captive, "you're sitting in Faraday's chair, and you're enjoying whiskey he used to drink." In both aspects, Tesla recalled, it was an enviable experience. The next evening I gave a demonstration before the Royal Institution. At the culmination of the lecture, much of which again was new material not presented the previous evening, but integrated into the above discussion, Tesla presented Lord Kelvin with one of his Tesla coils, and Lord Raleigh took over the lectern for the conclusion. Tesla recalled, "He said that I possessed a particular gift of discovery, and that I should concentrate upon one big idea. Coming from this ideal man of science, one who had worked out mathematical equations concerning the wavelength of light, and who had also calculated the atomic weights of many of the elements, this suggestion made a great impression. A new sense of destiny swirled through Tesla as he began to realize that he would have to figure out a way to surpass his earlier discoveries in AC. The next day, Tesla received an invitation from Ambrose Fleming to visit his lab at University College on the weekend. Fleming had been successful in setting up oscillatory discharges with a Spottiswoode coil as the primary and Leyden jars as the secondary, and he wanted to show Tesla his results. Having been a consultant to Edison in connection with the lighting industry, Fleming would 4 years hence work with Marconi in the development of the wireless, and a few years after that come to invent the rectifier, a device for converting the incoming electromagnetic waves of AC into DC upon entering the receiving apparatus. Having attended both lectures, Fleming congratulated Tesla heartily on your grand success. After this, no one can doubt your qualifications as a magician of the first order. The English aristocrat concluded by dubbing Tesla a member of the new fictitious Order of the Flaming Sword. Tesla had sparked the imagination of his British colleagues, and rapidly a number of them began to replicate his work and make their own advances. At Sir William Crookes's lab, Tesla constructed a coil as a gift and taught Crookes how to build Tesla coils on his own. But Crookes complained, "The phosphorescence through my body when I hold one terminal is decidedly inferior to that given with the little one that you made for me." As was his custom, Tesla toiled incessantly until the eclectic Crookes forced him to take a break, and at night, after dinner, the two scientists sat back and prognosticated. Topics range from discussions of the ramifications of their own research and potential future of the field to religion, Tesla's homeland, and metaphysics. Twirling an elongated wax moustache that fanned out like the tail feathers of a bird of paradise, the bearded mentor revealed that he had experimented in wireless communication before even Hertz began his investigations in 1889. Crookes discussed the possibility that electrical waves would be able to penetrate solid objects, such as walls, and he argued against Kelvin's suggestion that the life force and electricity were at some level identical. Nevertheless, electricity has an important influence upon vital phenomena, and is in turn set in action by the living being, animal or vegetable. Here Crookes was referring to various species, such as electric eels, iridescent sea slugs, and lightning bugs. Further speculation caused the two men to discuss the possibility that electricity could be utilized to purify water and treat sewage and industrial waste. Perhaps, Crookes suggested, proper frequencies could be generated to electrify gardens so as to stimulate growth and make crops unappealing to destructive insects. Expanding on the work of Rayleigh, Crookes discussed with Tesla the possibility of setting up millions of separate wavelengths so as to ensure secrecy in communication between two wireless operators. They also reviewed the work of Helmholtz on the structure of the physical eye, noting that receptors on the retina are sensitive to one set of wavelengths, i.e. visible light, and silent to others. In the same way, a receiving device for accepting electromagnetic signals might also be so constructed to receive certain transmissions and not others. Another point at which the practical electrician should aim, Crookes said in response to one of Tesla's more dauntless speculations, is in control of weather. Such goals as the elimination of fog, or the ghastly perennial drizzle that plagued the island, and creation of great amounts of rain scheduled for specific days were also discussed. And if this was not enough, Crookes also introduced Tesla to a vigorous discussion of his experiments in mental telepathy, spiritualism, and even human levitation. As a member of the Society of Psychical Research and later president, Crookes was in good company. Other scientists who would rise to the helm of the Psychic Society included Oliver Lodge, J.J. Thomson, and Lord Rayleigh. Crookes straightforwardly presented a plethora of convincing evidence, including drawings by receivers that matched those created by senders, photographs from seances of ectoplasmic materializations generated by the clairvoyant Florence Cook, and eyewitness accounts of levitation by himself and his wife. Those statements were enough to raise the eyebrows of anyone, and they served to rattle Tesla's world view. As a staunch materialist, up to that time Tesla had absolutely no belief in any aspect of the field of psychic research, including relatively tame occurrences such as thought transference. But with Crookes's documentation and the support of other members of the cognoscenti, especially Lodge, and with Tesla already exhausted from the strain of his severe schedule, the Serb's mind began to spin. He would drop off in the middle of conversations and subsequently frightened his host. The reality that he had constructed, and the world of superstition he thought he had left behind when he emigrated from the old world, swarmed through his brain like a hive of bumblebees, and shattered mightily his world view. The pressure Tesla was under caused Crookes to offer some friendly advice in a letter. "I hope you will get away to the mountains of your native land as soon as you can. You're suffering from overwork, and if you don't take care of yourself, you'll break down. Don't answer this letter or see anyone, but take the first train." Ending the letter on a waggish note, Crookes added, "I'm thinking of going myself, but I'm only thinking of going as far as Hastings." Tesla wanted to take his advice, but he had to address the Paris Society first. Tesla crossed the English Channel during the second week of February and booked a room at the Hotel de la Paix. At his upcoming lecture before a joint conference of the Société de Physique and the Société Internationale des Électriciens, which was held on February the 19th, the inventor sought out the well-known French physician Dr. d'Assonval, a pioneer in the field of diathermy. Tesla said later, "When Dr. d'Assonval declared that he had made the same discovery concerning the physical effects caused by sending extremely high frequency through the body, a heated controversy relative to priority was started. The French, eager to honor their countryman, made him a member of the Academy, ignoring entirely my earlier publication. Resolved to take steps for vindicating my claim, I met with Dr. d'Assonval. His personal charm disarmed me completely, and I abandoned my intention, content to rest on the record. It shows that my disclosure antedated his, and also that he used my apparatus in his demonstrations. The final judgment is left to posterity. Since the beginning, the growth of the new art of electrotherapy and industry has been phenomenal, some manufacturers turning out daily hundreds of sets. Many millions are now in use throughout the world. The currents furnished by them have proved an ideal tonic for the human nerve system. They promote heart action and digestion, induce healthful sleep, rid the skin of destructive exudations, and cure colds and fever by the warmth they create. They vivify atrophied or paralyzed parts of the body, allay all kinds of suffering, and save annually thousands of lives. Leaders in the profession have assured me that I have done more for humanity by this medical treatment than all my other discoveries and inventions. More recently, a number of researchers, particularly Dr. Robert O. Becker of Syracuse University, have utilized electrical currents to help heal bones that have difficulty knitting. Having studied regeneration capabilities of such reptiles as salamanders, whose tails he amputated, Becker has discovered that these animals generate a particular electrical frequency, which serves somehow as a field for promoting the total regrowth of the missing appendage. By artificially duplicating the signal, Becker reports, we've been able to produce partial limb regeneration in mammals such as rats by a similar technique, and some clinical applications are under study in human beings at this time. The Paris lecture ignited the French papers with Tesla's brilliant experiments. No man in our age has achieved such a universal scientific reputation in a single stride as this gifted young electrical engineer, the Electrical Review reported. Tesla met with a number of dignitaries while in Paris, including Prince Albert of Belgium, who was interested in supplying his country with a more economical means of distributing electric power, Monsieur Lucas of the Helios Company of Cologne, with whom Tesla sold his AC motor patents for use in Germany, and André Blondel, an important theoretician in advanced theories with alternating currents. 40 years later, Blondel recalled with immense interest and admiration the Paris conference and congratulated Tesla on the elegant simplicity with which he advanced his concepts in alternating current well beyond the work of his French colleague Desprez and his Italian neighbor Ferraris. Shortly after the lecture, and in a state of oblivion associated by my peculiar sleeping spells, which had been caused by prolonged exertion of the brain, Tesla received a dispatch at the hotel informing him that his mother was dying. I remembered how I made the long journey home without an hour of rest. Greeted in Gospic by his 3 sisters, all of whom were married to Serbian priests, and by his uncle Peter, the regional bishop, Tesla was in a terrible state. Entering the bedroom, he found his mother in agony. During this time, Tesla suffered from a peculiar malady similar to amnesia, where he claimed to have lost all memory of his earlier life. He also said that he slowly regained this information before his return to the States. One aspect of this episode which is noteworthy is that it occurred over a long period of time, beginning at the close of 1891 and culminating with his mother's death in April 1892. Tesla said that although he could not remember historical occurrences, he had no trouble thinking about the details of his research, including passages of text from his writings and complex mathematical formulae. Simultaneously, Tesla also experienced a psychic event, which momentarily impressed me as supernatural. I had become completely exhausted by pain and long vigilance, and one night was carried to a building about 2 blocks from our home. As I lay helpless there, I thought that if my mother died while I was away from her bedside, she would surely give me a sign. Having been influenced by my friend Sir William Crookes when spiritualism was discussed, Tesla lay in anticipation. During the whole night, every fibre in my brain was strained in expectancy. But nothing happened until early in the morning. Awakening in a swoon, I saw a cloud carrying angelic figures of marvellous beauty, one of whom gazed upon me lovingly and gradually assumed the features of my mother. The appearance slowly floated across the room and vanished, and I was awakened by an indescribably sweet song of many voices. In that instant, or certitude, I knew that my mother had just died, and that was true. Surprised, and perhaps even frightened by the clairvoyant vision, Tesla wrote to Crookes for advice. For months, and maybe even for years after, the inventor sought the external cause of this strange manifestation. Note how Tesla assumes a priori that the cause came from outside as opposed to inside, that is, from the unconscious. Although he readily accepted the concept of wireless communication, in no way was Tesla capable of allowing for the possibility that the human brain could also act as a receiver of mental vibrations. The idea of telepathy, or spiritualism for that matter, was a true threat to the paradigm he was operating from, and so Tesla manufactured a physical mechanism as the cause of his noetic experience. "To my great relief," Tesla wrote, "I succeeded, after many months of fruitless effort, in solving the conundrum." The vision of the angels rising up Tesla attributed to the memory of an ethereal painting of the same subject which he had gazed on prior to the experience, and the sound of the serenading voices he linked to a nearby church choir that was singing for an Easter Mass. Whether or not Tesla's mother died on a Sunday morning is not known, but what is clear is that this analysis greatly relieved the tension Tesla was under, for it supported once again a materialistic viewpoint. A question which remains, however, is whether or not Tesla's excesses in work-related endeavours is enough to explain his onset of amnesia. One theoretician speculated that the enormous voltages that Tesla passed through his body may have contributed to the problem. From a psychoanalytic point of view, one could speculate that Tesla was repressing, that is, unconsciously but purposefully forgetting events that he did not want to remember. Possible unwanted memories included the way he felt as a child after his exalted brother died, and the recent eradication of the royalty clause with the Westinghouse Corporation. After the death of his mother, Tesla stayed on in Gorspic for 6 weeks to recuperate. On the positive side, it enabled the lone son to reconfirm emotional ties to his family. It also provided Tesla with probably the only extended vacation he would ever take. He travelled to Plaszki to visit his sister Marika, to Varaždin to see his uncle Pajo, and to Zagreb to lecture at the university. He sojourned to Budapest to confer with Gantz and Company, as they were in the midst of constructing a substantial 1,000 horsepower alternator. He also met with a delegation of Serbian scientists who accompanied him down to Belgrade, where an audience was arranged with the king. Young Alexander I conferred upon Tesla a special title of Grand Officer of the Order of St. Sava, and the official plaque was shipped to him a few months later after his return to the States. Tesla also visited the great Serbian poet Jovan Šmaj Jovanović, and he attended an assembly where he was honored by the mayor. In front of a welcoming committee, Šmaj read his poem Pozdrav Nikola Tesla, and then Tesla took the podium. "There is something in me which is only perhaps illusory," Tesla began. "It is like that which often comes to young, enthusiastic persons. But if I were to be sufficiently fortunate to bring about at least some of my ideas, it would be for the benefit of all humanity." Referring back to Šmaj's poem, Tesla concluded with a message that would deeply touch the hearts of his people. "If these hopes become one day a reality, my greatest joy would spring from the fact that this work would be the work of a Serb. On his return leg, Tesla made a special trip through Prussia to see the eminent patriarch Hermann Ludwig von Helmholtz in Berlin and his most famous student, Heinrich Hertz, in Bonn. A bearded, youthful man with soft features, a high forehead and elongated face, Hertz had gained the world's attention by performing the first significant experiments in wireless, many of which Tesla replicated or expanded upon. In attempts to clarify the findings of James Clerk Maxwell on the nature of electromagnetic phenomena and its relationship to light and the structure of the ether, in 1886 Hertz constructed flat double-wound spiral coils, which he used in induction experiments in attempts to measure the propagation of electromagnetic waves. Hertz, like Tesla shortly after him, displayed resonance effects between primary and secondary circuits, and established the existence of standing waves with their characteristic nodes and troughs in a long straight wire. He was also able to measure the wavelength of the waves in the wire. Hertz, however, differed markedly with Tesla in terms of his interpretation of the meaning of Maxwell's equations and his subsequent conceptualization of the structure of the ether. Deriving his clarifications more from theory than from actual experimentation, Hertz had created an elegant mathematical interpretation of Maxwell's equations, but at the expense of some aspects of Maxwell's theory, most notably vector, a quantity that has magnitude and direction, and scalar, a quantity that has magnitude but no direction, such as a point or field potentials. In duplicating Hertz's work, Tesla postulated that these components should not have been eliminated. What he tried to tell Hertz, and what he wrote a few months later, was that electromagnetic waves might more appropriately be called electric sound waves, or sound waves of electrified air. When Dr. Heinrich Hertz undertook his experiments from 1887 to 1889, Tesla told an interviewer, his object was to demonstrate a theory postulating a medium filling all space called the ether, which was structureless, of inconceivable tenuity, and yet possessed of great rigidity. He obtained certain results, and the whole world acclaimed them as an experimental verification of that cherished theory. But in reality, what he observed tended to prove just its fallacy. I had maintained for many years before that such a medium as supposed could not exist, and that we must rather accept the view that all space is filled with a gaseous substance. On repeating the Hertz experiments with much improved and very powerful apparatus, I satisfied myself that what he had observed was nothing else but effects of longitudinal waves in a gaseous medium, that is to say, waves propagated by alternating compression and expansion. He had observed waves in much of the nature of sound waves in the air, not transverse electromagnetic waves as generally supposed. Tesla tried to open a dialogue by noting that his experiments tended to contradict the polished mathematical results Hertz had achieved, but Hertz rebuked him. He seemed disappointed to such a degree, Tesla recalled, that I regretted my trip and parted from him sorrowfully. Having replicated Hertz's experiments, Tesla tried to show the German professor that his own oscillator could produce a much more efficient frequency for transmitting wireless impulses. Tesla already had his eye on the idea of transmitting power through the ambient medium, and the Hertzian paradigm virtually disallowed this possibility. But egos clashed as one Weltanschauung threatened the other, and Hertz would never come to realize that his device was obsolete. Perhaps this was to Hertz's advantage, for even to this day wireless frequencies are referred to as Hertzian waves, when in fact they are really Teslas, as they are produced by high-frequency continuous wave oscillators, not by the primitive Hertzian interrupted spark gap apparatus. During the voyage home, Tesla walked the deck of the ship and pondered an incident that occurred to him during a hike he had taken in the mountains during the trip. Having witnessed an oncoming thunderstorm, he had noted that the rain was delayed until a flash of lightning was perceived. This observation confirmed Tesla's speculations, with Martin and Crookes, that weather control was possible because it was the production of large amounts of electricity, in Tesla's eyes, that caused the downpour. Revealing a megalomaniacal streak, Tesla recalled his thoughts that day in the Alps. Here was a stupendous possibility of achievement. If we could produce electric effects of the required quality, this whole planet and the conditions of existence on it could be transformed. The sun raises the water of the oceans, and the winds drive it to distant regions where it remains in a state of most delicate balance. If it were in our power to upset it when and wherever desired, this mighty life-sustaining stream could be at will, controlled. We could irrigate arid deserts, create lakes and rivers, and provide motive power in unlimited amounts. It seemed a hopeless undertaking, but I made up my mind to try it, and immediately upon my return to the United States in the summer of 1892, work was begun for the successful transmission of energy without wires. 11. Father of the Wireless, 1893. The day when we shall know exactly what electricity is will chronicle an event probably greater, more important, than any other recorded in the history of the human race. The time will come when the comfort, the very existence, perhaps, of man will depend upon that wonderful agent. Nikola Tesla. Tesla disembarked from the August Victoria in the last week of August 1892. The trauma associated with the death of his mother was alleged to have caused a shock of hair on his right temporal lobe to temporarily turn white. Whether this occurred cannot be determined. However, what is clear from studying photographs taken before and after the excursion is that a qualitative alteration in his appearance took place, the virginal look of adolescence supplanted by the cocksure demeanor of manhood. After 3 years at the Astor House, Tesla moved on to the Hotel Gerlach. Set up on the European plan by Charles A. Gerlach, its manager, the Gerlach was equipped with elevators, electric lights, and sumptuous dining rooms. The establishment was family-oriented and fireproof. Located on 27th Street between Broadway and 6th Avenue, the Gerlach was just a few blocks from the new magnificent Madison Square Garden, a modern galleria with shops, theaters, restaurants, a 30-story tower, and a coliseum with a seating capacity of 17,000. The garden, which was still under construction, was financed by banker J. Pierpont Morgan, who was funding Edison at the time. And it was designed and managed by Stanford White, the flamboyant architect of the prestigious firm of McKim, Mead & White, who would later become an important associate of Tesla's. Having unpacked his bags and cache of missives at the new hotel, on he went to South Fifth Avenue to his lab, which he had been away from for so long. In long strides, the inventor weaved his way through Washington Square, to the heart of that picturesque neighborhood known as the French Quarter. The streets were teeming with cheap restaurants, wine shops, and weather-beaten tenements, establishments Tesla would never frequent himself. To his surprise, he noticed shop owners waving, whispering among themselves. Some even displayed awe. Having been elected to the Royal Society of Great Britain, he had now become a célébrité internationale, and the neighborhood had been awaiting his return. He came upon what one reporter described as the uninviting huge yellowish brick building of some half-dozen stories, which housed his lab. Eagerly, the murky interior was entered as Tesla traversed the stairs, taking 2 at a time. He climbed past the oily, smelly lower floors, which were devoted to a pipe-cutting factory, even managed to smile for the owners of the dry cleaning service on the 3rd floor, and then entered his secluded haven on the 4th. The inventor had brought a number of books which he had purchased abroad, and he placed them in his library before proceeding into the machine room, where he spent some time removing dust and cobwebs. Tesla's prime concern was to exploit his advances in fluorescent lighting and wireless transmission of power. Over the next few weeks, he hired several workers and a secretary, and began by dictating an article on experiments he had conducted with Hertzian frequencies and their relationship to the surrounding medium. He refined his oscillators and designed an experiment whereby one of the terminals of a sizable transmitter was attached to one of the city's water mains, and he recorded electrical vibrations at different positions around town. "By varying the frequency," he said, "I was able to watch for evidence of resonance effects at various distances. I think that beyond doubt it is possible to operate electrical devices in a city through the ground or pipe system by resonance from an electrical oscillator located at a central point." Using vacuum tubes and other tuned circuits as detectors, Tesla began to study the principles of harmonics and standing waves, noting that his instruments would respond at certain points along the pipes, but not at other positions. There was also mail to answer and equipment to order. In September, correspondence was begun with Mr. Fodor, a German scientist who, with Tesla's help, translated his world-famous discourses into German. Shortly thereafter, Thomas Edison sent an inscribed photograph to Tesla from Edison. Tesla also conferred with Professor R.H. Thurston, a physics teacher from Cornell who had expertise in thermodynamics. At the end of the month, George Westinghouse stopped by with Albert Schmidt to welcome the inventor home and discuss the fate of the Tesla AC system. In May of that year, Westinghouse had won the bid to furnish the power for the upcoming Columbian Exposition, which was going to be held in Chicago, and he reportedly had taken $1 million loss in order to secure the contract. But even at this juncture, he was still not convinced that the Tesla system would prove to be more useful than compressed air and hydraulic power for long-distance transmissions. Although Tesla had great respect for the descendant of Russian noblemen, he still had difficulty hiding his dissatisfaction. Schmidt was relieved that the burden of convincing Westinghouse had shifted. "My conviction, Mr. Westinghouse, is that a motor without brushes and commutator is the only form which is capable of permanent success. To consider other plans, I consider a mere waste of time and money." Westinghouse asked for Tesla's help, particularly in aiding Schmidt, Scott, and Lamb, and Tesla agreed. Having been assured once again that the Tesla system was all that it promised to be and more, Westinghouse returned to Pittsburgh with a new sense of purpose. In the early part of 1893, Lamb wrote, "Much entirely new and novel apparatus was built for our Chicago World's Fair exhibit." Tesla would commute to and from Pittsburgh during this hectic time to guide the workers on the construction of the large dynamos, or Lamb, Schmidt, or Scott would stop by in New York for advice. They were also helping Tesla construct his own exhibit, which would appear under the Westinghouse banner. Scott was in charge of resurrecting Tesla's ingenious spinning egg, a device which not only aptly displayed the principles of the rotating magnetic field, but also paid homage to Christopher Columbus, the explorer whose accomplishments were being honored on this 400th anniversary of his transatlantic journey. Hence the title of the fair, the Columbian Exposition. The fair was slated to open in May, and this gave them only a few months to complete what was truly a Herculean task. Westinghouse may have won the right to light the fair, but Edison would not allow him a license to produce his light bulb. Fortunately for Westinghouse, he did have a viable patent on a Sawyer-Man stopper lamp, which had a rubber bottom where the filament was attached, in place of the Edison all-glass evacuated construction. Although less efficient, the Sawyer-Man lamp worked. With less than 6 months left until opening day, he had to produce 250,000 of these inferior bulbs. Coupled with the costs of legal disputes, the company was involved in a great risk venture. However, the prize, if all went successfully, would be the right to harness Niagara Falls. Potential revenues from such a contract would be immense. Tesla arranged for Mr. Luca of the Helios Company of Cologne to come to Pittsburgh to discuss supplying the German concern with AC equipment for their contract in Germany. "He has been sent here to gather information about railway, steam, and other motors," Tesla told Westinghouse. "I believe they would be ready to make a small cash payment and pay a moderate royalty, and I have done what I could to facilitate an understanding." Tesla had also secured other European connections, and soon revenues from abroad began to roll in. Nevertheless, there remained a good deal of animosity toward Tesla by some other members of the Westinghouse organization, partially because Tesla was paid so handsomely for an invention that they considered had also been conceived by Schellenberger, and partially because they simply didn't like the pompous foreigner. There were also great financial costs incurred in dismantling the hundreds of profitable Golar-Gibbs power stations which were dotted across the nation. In November 1892, Grover Cleveland, former hangman and sheriff of Buffalo, running on an anti-labor ticket, was re-elected President of the United States. Cleveland's second inauguration inflamed many segments of the population, and no doubt helped trigger the Panic of 1893. The calamity began in 1892 with the financial collapse of 4 major railroads. Then banks failed, and tens of thousands of people became unemployed. And the Westinghouse Company was just beginning a decade-long course of incurring enormous debt. Westinghouse realized that he had to back Tesla unconditionally as the sole inventor of the AC polyphase system. Had there been any ambiguity in the matter, competitors could seize an advantage by obscuring the origins of the invention, and thus they would be able to produce Teslaic technology without royalty payments to Westinghouse. On January the 16th, 1893, Westinghouse came out with an announcement touting the Tesla multiphase or polyphase system, which was circulated to the electrical magazines and major competitors. Having secured exclusive right to manufacture and sell apparatus covered by Tesla's patents, the Westinghouse Company promised to use such apparatus to economically harness the many waterfalls which were wasting so much energy. Now that the problems in Pittsburgh were somewhat alleviated, Tesla could devote more time to his upcoming lectures, which were going to be held at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia at the end of February, and again the following week in March at the annual meeting of the National Electric Light Association in St. Louis. He was met in Philadelphia by Professor Edwin Houston, formerly the partner of Houston's former student, Elihu Thomson. Tesla began his lecture in Philadelphia with a discussion of the human eye, nature's masterpiece. It is the great gateway through which all knowledge enters the mind. It is often said, the very soul shows itself in the eye. The study of the eye suggested a number of different and distinct lines of inquiry. For instance, it enabled Tesla to envision the precursor to television, with its numerous transfiguring pixels corresponding to the light-sensitive receiving cells of the retina. In another vein, in conjunction with instruments such as microscopes and telescopes, the eye also opened up new vistas for scientific inquiry. Alluding to the concept of the plurality of worlds, Tesla would say, "It was an organ of a higher order." "It is conceivable," Tesla continued, "that in some other world, in some other beings, the eye is replaced by a different organ, equally or more perfect, but these beings cannot be men." Obtaining information from all corners of the universe at the same time, the eye interacted with that elusive realm called the mind. Furthermore, this organ was also a perfect analogue of Tesla's Aristotelian worldview, as the eye had to be triggered from an external source in order to function. If we go back to one of Tesla's earlier experiments with the brush phenomena, that is, the creation of a brush or stream of light generated within an insulated vacuum bulb that responded to the faintest electromagnetic reverberations, we see that to Tesla this precursor to the radio tube was actually based on the principles inherent in the construction of the human eye. The brush, we remember, not only reacted to magnetic influences, but also to the approach of a person and to the torque of the earth, just as the eye also reacts to faint impulses from near or far. It is the only organ capable of being affected directly by the vibrations of the ether. The ether was a 19th century theoretical construct of an all-pervasive medium between the planets and stars. In 1881, Michelson and Morley unsuccessfully tried to measure the ether in their famous experiment with light beams and mirrors. The ramifications of their findings did not become evident until after the turn of the century, a full decade after Tesla's lecture, when Einstein used the Michelson-Morley experiment to suggest that, by its nature, the ether cannot be detected, and further, that it was unnecessary for explaining how light could travel through space. Physics professor Edwin Gora of Providence College, whose mentors included Arnold Sommerfeld and Werner Heisenberg, stated that the ether could not be detected with 19th century techniques, and that Einstein replaced the old ether with a new non-Euclidean space-time construct. This new, more abstract ether had such unusual properties as allowing space to curve around gravitational bodies. Completely disagreeing with Einstein and never abandoning the concept of the all-pervasive ether, Tesla said that space cannot be curved because something cannot act upon nothing. Light, according to Tesla, bent around stars and planets because they were attracted by a force field. Gora agreed that the two concepts of curved space and force field may actually be different viable ways of describing the same thing. Returning to the 1893 lecture, for Tesla the relationship of electrical phenomena to the structure of the ether appeared to be an important key to understanding how it could be transmitted without wires in an efficient manner. The problem of the transmission of electromagnetic energy through space was discussed in all three of his lectures on high-frequency phenomena. One question he considered was whether the ether was motionless or in motion. When vibrations were transmitted through it, it appeared to act like a still lake, but at other times the ether acted like a fluid to the motion of bodies through it. Referring to the investigations of Kelvin, Tesla concluded that the ether must be in motion. But regardless of this, there is nothing which would enable us to conclude with certainty that, while a fluid is not capable of transmitting transverse vibrations of a few hundred or thousand per second, it might not be capable of transmitting such vibrations when they range into hundreds of millions per second. Tesla would later claim spectacular results in wireless transmission, never duplicated by any other researcher. He states that his system was not bound to the inverse square laws, and it appears that his success, if indeed it was a success, was based on the premise that above certain frequencies the ether revealed novel and heretofore unknown features. Perhaps threshold values were involved. Tesla continued his discussion on the structure of the ether and its relationship to electromagnetic phenomena by making two observations. One, that energy could be transmitted by independent carriers, and two, that atomic and subatomic particles whirled around each other like little solar systems. These two concepts, which were tied to the mystery of the structure of the ether, predated similar ideas proposed by quantum physicists Ernest Rutherford, Niels Bohr, and Albert Einstein by at least a decade. In Rutherford's case, he is often credited as the first physicist to view the atom as structured somewhat like a solar system. It is evident, however, that Rutherford referred to Tesla's high-frequency lectures in 1895 when he constructed high-frequency AC equipment for conducting long-distance wireless experiments. Tesla stated that he could create electromagnetic oscillations that displayed transverse and also longitudinal wave characteristics. The first, transverse case, corresponds to the concept of the ether as a medium for propagating wave-like impulses, and the second, longitudinal case, corresponds to what today is known as a quantum of energy analogous to the way sound waves travel through the air. Tesla maintained, against all opposition even to this day, that his electromagnetic frequencies traveled in longitudinal, bullet-like impulses, and thus they carried much more energy than can be ascribed to Hertzian transverse waves. In fact, as alluded to before, Hertz wanted to eliminate the idea of mass from the Maxwellian electromagnetic equations. Tesla's idea of longitudinal waves in the ether appear to be a direct outcropping of the research undertaken by Ernst Mach, who was still at Prague at the time. Mach's radical views on the relationship between consciousness, space, and time, and the nature of gravity, were beginning to alter greatly the thinking of a number of key individuals. His idea, which came to be known as Mach's principle, hypothesized that all things in the universe were interrelated. For example, the mass of the Earth, according to this theory, was dependent on a supergravitational force from all stars in the universe. Nothing was separate. This view, which Mach realized corresponded to Buddhist thinking, paralleled closely views espoused by Tesla. Although the following quote was written almost a quarter of a century later, its link to Tesla's 1893 lecture is clear. There is no thing endowed with life, from man, who is enslaving the elements, to the nimblest creature, in all this world that does not sway in its turn. Whenever action is born from force, though it be infinitesimal, the cosmic balance is upset, and universal motion results. This idea was extended and interlinked between living organisms and inert matter by Tesla. All are susceptible to stimulus from the outside. There is no gap between, no break of continuity, no special and distinguishing vital agent. The same law governs all matter. All the universe is alive. The source of power which runs the universe is that found within the sun's heat and light. Wherever they are, there is life. As these processes were electrical in nature, to Tesla, the secret of electricity held the secret of life. Looking at the world around him, Tesla realized that it was a finite place, and that the natural resources, which gave humans the fuel to produce electricity, would eventually run out. What will man do when the forests disappear, when the coal deposits are exhausted? He asked his Philadelphia audience. Only one thing, according to our present knowledge, will remain. That is to transmit power at great distances. Man will go to the waterfalls and to the tides, Tesla speculated, because these, unlike coal and oil reserves, are replenishable. Having set up the premise that it could be possible to derive inexhaustible amounts of energy with properly constructed equipment, that is, to attach our engines to the wheelwork of the universe, Tesla described for the first time ever his invention of wireless transmission. Cloaking his true goals in more palatable language, he announced, "I firmly believe that it is practicable to disturb by means of powerful machines the electrostatic conditions of the Earth, and thus transmit intelligible signals and perhaps power." Taking into consideration the speed of electrical impulses with this new technology, all ideas of distance must vanish, as humans will be instantaneously interconnected. First, we must know what capacity the Earth is and what charge it contains. Tesla also speculated that the Earth was probably a charged body insulated in space, and thus had a low capacity. The upper strata, much like the vacuum created in his Geissler tubes, would probably be an excellent medium for transmitting impulses. We see here the precursor to the discovery by Heaviside and Kennelly of the ionosphere. Tesla had already thrust large amounts of electrical energy into the Earth to try to measure its period of frequency, but he had yet to come up with a figure that appeared accurate. Nevertheless, he knew the size of the Earth and the speed of light, and thus was already at this time formulating optimum wavelengths for transmitting impulses through the planet. During his talk, Tesla demonstrated impedance phenomena by turning on and off a light bulb by placing it at various positions along an electrified metal bar. Based somewhat on the work of Hertz, this experiment demonstrated the concepts of wavelength and standing waves. He constructed circuits with 2 or 3 bulbs independently connected in a row and placed metal bars at various points along the way, thereby illuminating or extinguishing one or another of these bulbs by impeding or not impeding the electrical flow. He also displayed electric lamps illuminated with only a single wire, and therefore was able to establish that the wire itself could be replaced by connecting the lamp directly to the Earth, which was also a conductor, as no return circuit, as found in the Edison bulbs, was necessary. As before, Tesla also displayed lamps illuminated with no connections whatsoever. With pure resonance, Tesla suggested, wires become unnecessary, since impulses can be jumped from sending device to receiver. Naturally, the receiving instruments would have to be tuned to the frequency of the transmitter. If ever we can ascertain at what period the Earth's charge, when disturbed or oscillates with respect to an oppositely electrified system or known circuit, we shall know a fact possibly of the greatest importance to the welfare of the human race. Tesla proceeded to present a diagram which depicted how to set up the aerials, receivers, transmitter, and ground connection. The son of one of his assistants described the apparatus. In the transmitter group on one side of the stage, was a 5 kVA high-voltage pole-type oil-filled distribution transformer connected to a condenser bank of Leyden jars, a spark gap, a coil and wire running up to the ceiling. In the receiving group at the other side of the stage was an identical wire hanging from the ceiling, a duplicate condenser bank of Leyden jars and a coil, but instead of the spark gap, there was a Geisler tube that would light up when voltage was applied. When the switch was closed, the transformer grunted and groaned. The Leyden jars showed corona sizzling around their foil edges. The spark gap crackled with a noisy spark discharge, and an invisible electromagnetic field radiated energy into space from the transmitter antenna wire to the receiver antenna wire. Tesla elaborated. "When the electric oscillation is set up," he said, "there will be a movement of electricity in and out of the transmitter, and alternating currents will pass through the Earth. In this manner, neighboring points on the Earth's surface within a certain radius will be disturbed." Although Tesla's main goal was to transmit power, he also noted that, theoretically, it would not require a great amount of energy to produce a disturbance perceptible at great distance, or even all over the surface of the globe. In Tesla's autobiography, written a quarter of a century later, the inventor informs the reader that there was such opposition to his discussion of wireless telegraphy at that time that only a small part of what I had intended to say was embodied in the speech. This little salvage from the wreck has earned me the title Father of the Wireless. Tesla stated that it was Joseph Wetzler who told him to de-emphasize his work in wireless in this lecture. Wetzler probably edited out a number of key passages which in the long run could have helped Tesla establish more easily his priorities in the field. Nevertheless, the entire Philadelphia speech runs 100 typeset pages and covers numerous other topics as well. What is important to realize is that for the first time ever, a major inventor announced bold possibilities in the field of wireless communication. Simultaneously, he explained in step-by-step fashion all of the major components that would be needed for success. The question of who invented the radio is complex, for there was no single developer. Experiments in wireless can be traced back to Joseph Henry, who in 1842 transmitted electrical energy across a 30-foot room between magnetized needles and sensitive Leyden jars, and to Samuel Morse, who sent messages in 1847 by means of induction across an 80-foot wide canal by using something called current leakage. The first individual to transmit messages over long distances using aerials, in the form of kites and a ground connection, was Mahlon Loomis. A dentist and experimentalist who also used electricity to stimulate growth in plants, Loomis not only received a patent on the device in 1872, but also successfully introduced the Loomis Aerial Telegraphy Bill before the U.S. Congress. Loomis made such an impact that $50,000 was appropriated to help him in his pursuit. In 1886, Loomis sent wireless messages 14 miles between two mountains in Virginia, and a few years later he also sent messages between ships 2 miles apart in Chesapeake Bay. There is little doubt that Tesla was aware of Loomis. For one thing, his patent was registered, and Tesla always made it a practice to study the work of his precursors. Also, it should be noted that some of the wording from Loomis's patent applications and published writings sound eerily like the wording in some of Tesla's discourses. For instance, Loomis discusses the passing of electrical vibrations or waves around the world, and principles of harmonics and resonance, and he also refers to harnessing the wheel work of nature, a favored term of Tesla's. In 1875, Thomas Edison, while working with Charles Batchelor, noticed an unusual sparking effect emanating from the core of an electromagnet which leapt to non-charged bodies several feet away. By using an electroscope, he was unable to distinguish a charge. In actuality, he had created a high frequency that could not be detected by his equipment. By charging a gas main, Edison was able to obtain sparks from the fixtures in his house several blocks away. Edison thought that since energy can take various forms, and it was possible to change electricity to magnetism, magnetism might be transformed into something else. Edison therefore announced to the scientific community that he had discovered a new unknown force. Possibly Tesla's ideas of connecting an oscillator to the water mains of a city may have been influenced by this research. In the early 1880s, William Preece, electrical engineer for the British Post Office, began directing experiments in wireless communication by means of an inductive apparatus. He was probably also the first inventor to realize that the Earth itself was an integral component in the successful implementation of any wireless system. After isolating the role of the Earth as either a primary or secondary circuit, Preece utilized telephone receivers as detecting devices and concluded that on ordinary working telegraph lines the disturbance reached a distance of 3,000 feet, while effects were detected on parallel lines of a telegraph 10 to 40 miles apart in some sections of the country. Preece's work of detecting earth currents, which was duplicated by Western Union engineers in the United States, significantly influenced the theories expounded by Tesla. Preece had displayed a long-standing interest in wireless communications. He had visited Edison in the mid-1880s, just after Tesla emigrated to America, to witness firsthand Edison's latest invention, which he called the grasshopper telegraph, a device for jumping messages from dispatch stations to moving trains. By means of induction or resonance, a metal strip attached to a telephone receiver on a moving railroad car would send or receive messages from a similar strip strung parallel to the track at the station. Although the invention never evolved beyond this primitive early stage, the patent would later have important legal significance in priority battles over the invention of the wireless. Thus Edison is clearly one of the fathers of wireless transmission, as are Henry Morse, Loomis, and Preece. Concerning the history of radio tubes, Edison also had an important invention, discussed above, of a dual-filament light bulb, which displayed a flow of current between them, Preece having named it the Edison effect. J.J. Thomson used it to help in his discovery of the electron, and Tesla combined information from this device with Crookes's work on radiation effects inside evacuated glass tubes to invent his brush phenomena, which was the first such vacuum tube explicitly created for wireless transmission of intelligence. Other precursors to Tesla included Heinrich Hertz, Oliver Lodge, and Edouard Branly. A French professor of physics, Branly, perhaps influenced by the knowledge of the Edison effect, noticed that the gap of Hertz's tuned circuits could be replaced by a glass-enclosed tube which contained finely scattered metallic particles. When current passed through the tube by means of wireless induction, the particles aligned themselves along the path of the gap and closed the circuit. A light tapping on the tube opened the circuit once again until transmission occurred. Lodge perfected Branly's 1890 discovery of particle cohesion and labeled it the coherer. These scientists were not thinking about wireless telegraphy at the time of their initial work. They were explorers in a new field of electromagnetic induction, and it was not until 1894, by Lodge's own calculation, that he thought in terms of utilizing the equipment as a means of conveying information. On the other hand, we remember that Crookes, writing in 1892, at the very time he was meeting with Tesla in England, noted that he had experimented in the wireless transmission of Morse code from one end of the house to another at about the same time as Hertz and Lodge were experimenting in the late 1880s, but he never publicized his work or furthered the invention beyond this casual experiment. Tesla realized, as did Hertz, that the Hertzian frequencies through space were not conductive for long-range communication, but unlike Hertz, Tesla sought a way around this limiting factor. Therefore, he devised not only the means of securing more powerful transmitters, but also concatenated tuned circuits, which were, in essence, sensitive radio tubes for receiving information. During this speech in Philadelphia, Tesla also introduced the concept of using both an aerial and ground connection and a single wire as a return for the operation of all kinds of devices. This system of wireless transmission was outlined in detail in highly visible articles which appeared in 1891, during his first public demonstrations of wireless Geissler tubes at Columbia College, in 1892 in Europe, and were explicitly delineated in 1893. It would be another full year before a high school boy by the name of Guglielmo Marconi would begin his first tinkerings in the field. 12. Electric Sorcerer, 1893. It was known that Mr. Tesla, who enjoys a high reputation as an electrician, had been experimenting upon a practically new electric light, but it was not known outside his laboratory that he had achieved such wonderful results or come so near to revolutionizing the theory of light. Other electrical explorers, especially Dr. Hertz and Dr. Larch, had evolved the theory that the phenomena of light were related to the electromagnetic vibrations of ether or air, but it remained for Mr. Tesla to demonstrate this fact and make the knowledge practically available. New York Recorder. Tesla left Philadelphia by rail at the end of February for the National Electric Light Association convention in St. Louis. Accompanied by T.C. Martin, who was covering both lectures for electrical engineer, they discussed the creation of a textbook based on the inventor's collected writings. The first half would be devoted to the full range of inventions associated with the AC polyphase system, with chapters on motor design, single-phase and polyphase circuits, armatures and transformers. The second half would contain Tesla's 3 discourses on high-frequency phenomena, which he had presented in New York, London and Philadelphia. With an introduction written by Martin and a few miscellaneous articles at the end, the treatise would run almost 500 pages. Josh Wetzler would be a second editor. Publication date was set for the end of the year. Martin had achieved a great coup, solidifying a deal with what many people were saying was the greatest living electrician. The inventions, researches and writings of Nikola Tesla would be a landmark text, becoming a virtual Bible for the numerous electricians who read it. On February the 28th, Tesla arrived in St. Louis, invited to speak by James I. Ayer, general manager of the local municipal electric light and power company. The arrival of the inventor created a jolt of excitement. His speech was billed as a replication of the London lecture. Over 4,000 copies of the journal containing a biographical sketch were sold upon the streets, something unprecedented in the history of electrical journalism. A procession of 80 electrical utility wagons and meter-men carts rolled down Main Street as thousands of people clamored to get tickets for the performance. At the opening ceremony, both Tesla and Ayer were inducted into the association as honorary members. Afterward, Ayer introduced Tesla to one of his engineers, H.P. Broughton, a recent graduate of Cornell University, who was assigned as an assistant for the duration of the convention. The chamber allocated proved to be too small, so the event was moved to the Grand Music Entertainment Hall, a large auditorium with a seating capacity of over 4,000. Tickets were hawked on the steps for anywhere from $3 to $5. Yet even this theatre proved to be inadequate, for the house was crowded to suffocation. Mr. Ayer introduced the inventor to the audience with a sort of reverence as one who has an almost magic power over the vast hidden secrets of nature, and presented Tesla with a magnificent floral shield wrought in white carnations and red beauty roses. Peering out at the sea of faces, Tesla realized that it would be wise to restrict his lecture to the more spectacular experiments. With Broughton, he displayed his invention of wireless transmission of electrical energy by lighting up wireless receiving tubes by throwing a switch from the opposite side of the room. "Of all the many marvelous things we observe," he said, "to me it seems a vacuum tube excited by an electrical impulse from a distant source, bursting forth out of the darkness and illuminating the room with its beautiful light, is as lovely a phenomenon as can greet our eyes." By way of amusement, Tesla created sheets of electricity between 2 condenser plates. He illuminated light bulbs with and without filaments, ignited phosphorescent globes that threw a most dazzling light far beyond that yielded by any ordinary phosphorescence, and created strobe effects by whirling tubes that looked like white spokes of a wheel of glowing moonbeams. Tesla then approached his most powerful coil. Noticing Professor George Forbes in the audience, the engineer from Glasgow who had so highly recommended his AC system to the Niagara Power Commission, the inventor bowed in respect, Acknowledging his appreciation, Tesla predicted that ere long great surges of electric energy based on this work would soon usher from the great waterfall. These next series of experiments are shown with some reluctance, yet forced thereto by the desire to gratify those who had shown such interest and formed so large an audience, I see I have little choice. Charging my body with electricity from an apparatus which I have devised, I can make the electricity vibrate at the rate of 1,000,000 times a second. The molecules of the air are then violently agitated, so violently that they become luminous, and streams of light then come out from the hand. In the same manner, I am able to take in the hand a bulb of glass filled with certain substances and make them spring into light. I had the pleasure of performing these very experiments privately before Lord Rayleigh, and I will always remember this distinguished scientist trembling in eagerness and excitement when he witnessed them. The appreciation I have received from such a distinguished scientist as he has repaid me fully for the pains to which I have worked to achieve these ends." Tesla thereupon turned to the coil and announced that due to the enormous potentials about to be generated, he had constructed the machine with hard rubber insulation, as even dry wood is by far too poor for protection. I now approached the free terminal with a metallic object held in my hand, this simply to avoid burns. The sparks cease when the metal touches the wire. My arm is now traversed by a powerful electric current, vibrating at about 1,000,000 times a second. All around me the electrostatic force is felt, and the air molecules and particles of dust flying about are acted upon and are hammering violently against my body. So great is this agitation of the particles that when the lights are turned out, you may see streams of feeble light appear on some parts of my body. When such a streamer breaks out, it produces a sensation like the pricking of a needle. Were the potential sufficiently high and the frequency low, the skin would probably be ruptured under the tremendous strain, and the blood would rush out with great force in the form of a fine spray. Extending his fingers like a preening peacock, the electric sorcerer issued flames of lightning, as if he were Thor himself. "The streamers offer no particular inconvenience," he assured the audience, "except that in the ends of the fingertips a burning sensation is felt." With his coil still charged and flames still shooting from his head, a number of other effects were displayed, including the running of motors by way of energy through his body, and the lighting of a variety of colourful tubes which the inventor waved about as if they were phosphorescent rapiers. His finale included the stretching of a series of long cotton strings across the stage, which he zapped with a pencil-lined corona of violet that etched a dazzling glow along its length, illuminating the stage in an eerie iridescence. Shouts of "Bravo!" accompanied the thunderous applause as the lecturer bowed again and again in response. Shimmering from after-effects and still emitting ethereal flames and fine halos of splintered light after the lecture, Tesla was called to the lobby so that he could be greeted by many members of the admiring public. So great was the desire to see Mr. Tesla closer that several hundreds of the leading citizens seized the opportunity and Mr. Tesla's hand in a very vigorous manner. Upon his return to New York, Tesla completed his citizenship requirements. No longer would his patent applications refer to him as a subject of the Emperor of Austria, but rather as a citizen of the United States. This was a proud moment. He would keep these papers safely stored away in a vault in his room for the rest of his life. Now a full American, Tesla decided once and for all to take on the mighty icon Thomas Edison. Setting up one of his most provocative experiments, the upstart attacked head-on Edison's carbon filament lamp. Taking two identical bulbs, one filled with air and the other containing a vacuum, and attaching it to a current vibrating about 1,000,000 times a second, Tesla demonstrated that the lamp filled with ordinary air did not glow, but the one with the vacuum glowed brightly. This showed the great importance of the rarefied gas in the heating of the conductor, and furthermore, the new light was cool to the touch. Brazenly, Tesla could conclude, in incandescent lighting, a high-resistance filament, Edison's invention, does not at all constitute the really essential element of illumination. Taking the same two bulbs, Tesla then lowered the frequency, converted it to DC, and showed that the filament in the non-exhausted bulb now began to glow, though not as intensely as the other. He concluded that with DC, the filament was the essential component. With high-frequency AC, the atmosphere around the filament, and thus the vacuum, was paramount. The higher the frequency, the more efficient the illuminant. In fact, he noted, if DC were abandoned altogether and extremely high frequencies used, there would be no need for a filament at all. Edison became perturbed, not only because he had sent men to the Orient, Central America, and the Amazon in order to find the perfect filament, but also because one or two of them died in the quest. That pompous Serb was not only saying that AC was intrinsic to the development of any practical lighting system, he was also proclaiming that Edison's most famous work would eventually be for naught. At a cottage by Edison's rock-crushing factory in Ogden, New Jersey, a local newspaper reporter asked the inventor about the possibility of producing light from electricity without heat. Edison murmured that this feat had been achieved, but the reporter pressed him. "I specifically mean with reference to discoveries in the line taken up by Nikola Tesla." Edison rose from his easy chair, spat another wad of tobacco off the porch, and barked, "It is a problem surrounded by difficulties." "And what about Tesla?" "He has made no new discovery," the chief wizard began, "but has shown considerable ingenuity in increasing vibrations. He gets his results from the induction coil and the Geisler tube." "Do you think it will replace your light bulb?" "Light without heat may be obtained someday, but I do not care to prophesy that it will be a pleasant light. Its biggest trouble is its quality. It is a ghastly color, more like the light of lightning bugs than anything else." Certainly in this regard Edison was entirely correct, as even today the light bulb generates a more pleasant glow than fluorescent tubes. However, as anyone who has changed a light bulb knows, Edison's invention is constructed so as to break down within a few months, whereas Teslaic fluorescent lights can last for years, even decades. Furthermore, according to Tesla's view, the incandescent lamp created a harsh, bright light from a small central source. It was Tesla's plan to create a pleasing light from a very large, spherical surface. Now, for the first time, Nikola Tesla was sought after by the popular press. Quoted as being modest by many interviewers and sometimes self-effacing, initially Tesla avoided publicity. But his sensational accomplishments had made him a folk hero, and it was now up to the journalists to find out why. The New York Herald was the first newspaper to capitalize on the rising star. In a long feature article adorned with an etching drawn from an outdated photograph, the Herald described the inventor's demeanor and his heritage, and discussed the full range of his future plans. "Mr. Tesla is such a hard worker that he has little time for social pleasures, if indeed he has any taste in that direction. He is a bachelor, tall, very spare of build, has dark, deep-set eyes, jet-black hair, and an expression that suggests at once the deep thinker. Though polite and even friendly to newspaper men, he has no desire to exploit himself in print." Tesla described his parents and schooling, his invention of the rotating magnetic field, and also his new system of lighting, which he promised would be a more practical illuminant than we have at present. He discussed the possibility of sending vast amounts of electricity along wires from Niagara Falls, and also the concept of wireless transmission of intelligence and power through the earth and air to any distance. From present experimental evidence, it can be quite safely concluded that an attempt to transmit intelligible sounds through the earth from here, for instance, to the European continent without any cable will succeed beyond a doubt. Such a result, which I have advocated for 2 years, if achieved, would of course be of incalculable value to the world and greatly advance the progress of the human race. The Herald ended with a question about how it felt to send hundreds of thousands of volts through the body, and Tesla replied, "If you are prepared for the shock, the effect on the nerves is not nearly as great. Initially, you feel a burn, but beyond that, the feeling is scarcely noticeable. I have received currents as high as 300,000 volts, an amount which, if received in any other way, would instantly kill. Although the travel and the lectures were digressions, Tesla accepted the engagements to solidify his place in the history of electrical science. For the cloistered conceptualist, naturally the accolades and interaction with colleagues were also inducements. However, it was only now, as he was being sought after by reporters and the adoring public, that he began to realize, in a conscious sense, his latent desire for recognition. Every hour, every moment that was not spent working on inventions was time away from his purpose. Even the intervals spent eating and sleeping delayed progress. Although both his parents had passed away at relatively young ages, there were other kin whose lifespan had traversed more than 10 decades. Perhaps in part as a defense, Tesla would exclaim that he expected to attain centenarian status. He had come to see the human body in its essence as a machine, one that could be efficiently regulated by the stern application of willpower, and so Tesla exerted his will to reduce his sleeping to a minimum and his eating to the bare necessities. Although over 6 feet tall, he kept his weight to a scant and unvarying 142 pounds. The strain was beginning to show, but the Serb was on a quest. His goal was nothing short of saving the whole of humanity through the application of his fertile brain. Having transmitted energy by means of wireless from one end of a room to another, the inventor's next task was to devise a way to extend this principle to generate larger amounts of power and to create separate, non-interfering channels. Tesla began to experiment with more and more powerful oscillators, ones that would not only radiate high-frequency AC, but also ones capable of engendering physical pulsations. The first gratifying result was obtained in the spring, when I reached tensions of about 1 million volts with my conical coil. That was not much in the light of the present art, Tesla wrote a quarter of a century later, but it was then considered a feat. According to calculations performed by Professor John Tyndall, the Edison electric light bulb had an efficiency of about 5%, meaning that 95% of the electricity produced went into the production of heat or was simply lost in transit. The gas flame, which was still by far the most common form of artificial luminescence, had an efficiency of less than 1%. As Tesla told Martin, "If we were dealing with a corrupt government, such wretched waste would not be tolerated." This squander was on a par with the wanton destruction of whole forests for the sake of a few sticks of lumber. The energy, as Martin wrote, is more or less frittered away, just as in July the load in an iceman's cart crumbles and melts along the street. Whereas armies of inventors had flung themselves on the difficulties involved in these barbaric losses occurring at every stage, Tesla had designed an entirely original series of inventions which either converted electricity to rotary action or practically the reverse, that is, converted steam power into electrical energy. In the first instance, Tesla constructed a high-frequency oscillator, which was immersed in a vat of oil. By modulating the frequency of an AC, he caused the oil to flow at varying rates. Just like a water wheel turning a turbine, this oil caused a blade to rotate. By increasing the frequency, the flow would change, and the rotation of the turbine would be increased. In the second instance, that is, in the case of the steam generator, Tesla combined into one invention both an engine and a dynamo, and created a device that was as much as 1/40th the size of comparable traditional constructions. In the old-fashioned steam engine, the reciprocating back-and-forth piston action had to be converted to a rotary effect by way of a crankshaft and flywheel. This device, in turn, was connected to a turbine, which thereby produced electricity. In the Tesla generator, a steam-driven piston attached to a condenser was made to bob up and down within a magnetic field, cutting the lines of force, thereby producing a current. This procedure reduced markedly the loss involved in converting mechanical action to electrical power. There was no flywheel or crankshaft. Martin eloquently wrote, "We note immediately the absence of all the governing appliances of the ordinary engine. They are non-existent. The steam chest is the engine bared to the skin, like a prize fighter, with every ounce counting. Denuded in this way of superfluous weight and driven at high pressure, the engine must have an economy far beyond the common. With an absence of friction due to the automatic cushioning of the light working parts, it is also practically indestructible. Furthermore, whereas the ordinary steam piston, weighing perhaps as much as 1,000 pounds, could only change its direction, say 10 times per second, the Tesla oscillator could oscillate at 100 strokes a second. Tesla hoped not only to reduce the complexity of existing equipment, but also to create a current that would maintain a vibration with perfect constancy. He took out patents on both of these devices in the summer. With these various oscillators, Tesla could provide a plethora of effects. Electrically, he could generate precise frequencies that could be used to transmit information or electrical energy. When the oscillator was pulsating at the frequency of light, he could manifest luminescence as well, and mechanically he could create pulsations through metal bars or pipes and test for harmonic frequencies and standing waves. By studying impedance phenomena, he could transmit electromagnetic energy through such a conduit and cause a light to illuminate at certain positions along its length, but not at others. And if he increased the vibrations and struck a harmonic frequency, he could get the iron rod to begin to vibrate with such intensity that it would crack it